14 bullets killed a Catholic cardinal in broad daylight at a major international airport. Nobody was ever punished for it. Mexico called it a mistake. The Vatican called it a murder. The truth was something far worse than either of them admitted. El Chapo's name was whispered at the crime scene, but the real story points somewhere nobody dared to look. Court testimony buried it. Government files sealed it. The people who knew too much are dead now. Netflix gave you a kingpin. Charming, calculated, almost romantic. The real Joaquín Guzmán was a third-grade dropout who owned presidents, built tunnels under international borders, and moved more poison into America than any human being in recorded history. He did it because the system didn't just allow him to. The system worked for him. This is the story Narcos never told you. And it is far darker than anything Netflix put on screen. Narcos introduced El Chapo as a minor character who slowly climbed his way up. That is not what happened. He was born April 4, 1957 in La Tuna, Sinaloa, a mountain village so remote it had no electricity, no running water, and no way out. His father grew opium poppies because it was the only crop that paid enough to feed a family. El Chapo understood the drug trade before he could read properly. He left school after third grade and never went back. For the rest of his life, he could not write complex letters. He ran a multi-billion-dollar operation through intermediaries because putting words on paper was beyond him. Narcos dressed him in sharp clothing and gave him the composure of a boardroom executive. The real Chapo wore baseball caps and cowboy boots and communicated through people he trusted not to betray him. What he lacked in education, he replaced with something that worked better in his world. From his first days inside the Guadalajara cartel, he had one rule. If a drug shipment arrived late, he shot the smuggler himself in the head without a conversation. Nobody ever needed to be told twice. Nobody was ever late again. In 2013, the Chicago Crime Commission named Joaquín Guzmán Public Enemy No. 1. He is the only individual to receive that designation since Al Capone, and there is no evidence he ever set foot in Chicago. He ran that city's entire drug supply from a mountain village in Sinaloa that most Mexicans had never heard of. That is the distance between what Narcos showed you and what El Chapo actually built. Before El Chapo built his own empire, he learned from the man who built the first one. Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo ran the Guadalajara cartel in the 1980s and controlled virtually every drug route from Mexico into the United States. El Chapo was not a boss in that organization. He was a logistics worker, a young man from Sinaloa who understood how to move product efficiently and who was willing to do things other men hesitated to do. When DEA agent Enrique Camarena was kidnapped, tortured, and murdered in 1985, the United States applied pressure on Mexico unlike anything the cartels had faced before. The Guadalajara cartel collapsed under that pressure, and Félix Gallardo was arrested in 1989. What happened next is what Narcos never properly explained. Félix Gallardo divided his organization from inside prison, splitting territory between trusted associates and creating the structure that would define Mexican drug trafficking for the next 30 years. El Chapo received the Sinaloa Corridor, at the time considered a secondary prize, a mountain region with limited infrastructure and no obvious advantage over rival routes. Within a decade, that corridor became the most powerful drug trafficking operation on Earth. He turned a geographic disadvantage into the foundation of a billion-dollar empire by doing what nobody before him had seriously attempted at scale. He went underground, and the world above never saw it coming. Narcos gave you one tunnel, one dramatic escape sequence with a laundry cart and a lucky exit. That is not what El Chapo built. He built an underground infrastructure that moved billions of dollars worth of drugs beneath the United States border, as if the border did not exist. These tunnels had electricity, rail systems, and ventilation strong enough to keep workers alive for hours underground. Some ran for over a mile. Engineers designed them. Professional construction crews built them. By the time American officials understood the full scale of what they were finding, El Chapo's product was already in warehouses, on street corners, and in the bloodstreams of people across the country. Narcos made the tunnels look like a clever trick. They were an industrial supply chain operating beneath the feet of two governments. And the tunnels were only one method. El Chapo also built narco submarines, semi-submersible vessels that traveled just below the water's surface, invisible to radar, carrying cocaine from Colombian shores directly to Mexico. He used catapults to launch drug packages over border fencing in areas where tunnels were too difficult to construct. He hid shipments inside chili pepper cans, fire extinguishers, and frozen fish. Inside anything a border inspector would consider too ordinary to open. He told Sean Penn personally in 2015 that he had a fleet of submarines, airplanes, trucks, and boats. He said he supplied more heroin, methamphetamine, cocaine, and marijuana than anybody else in the world, and he said it the way a man describes something he considers obvious. The DEA called him the godfather of the drug world and estimated that his influence surpassed Pablo Escobar's at the height of the Medellin cartel. That is the man Netflix spent 3 seasons portraying as El Chapo's inspiration. Over 3 decades, El Chapo smuggled hundreds of tons of narcotics across the world. At the time of his final arrest, the Sinaloa cartel controlled between 40% and 60% of Mexico's entire drug trade, with annual revenues estimated at $3 billion. El Chapo did not survive for decades by outsmarting the government. He survived because he owned enough of it to make being caught a temporary inconvenience. When he was first arrested in 1993 and placed inside Puente Grande, Mexico's most secure prison at the time, he had the facility under his control within weeks. Guards ran his errands, gourmet food was delivered to his cell, and he received visitors the prison system had no official record of. He met a woman named Zulema Hernandez inside that prison, a former police officer serving time for armed robbery. After her release, he placed her in charge of the Sinaloa cartel's expansion into Mexico City. In 2008, her body was found in a car trunk. The letter Z had been carved into her skin multiple times, the signature of Los Zetas, the cartel's most dangerous rivals. That detail never appeared in Narcos. That is the world El Chapo actually operated in, where the people closest to him ended up in trunks with messages carved into them. When he escaped in 2001, Narcos showed him curled inside a laundry cart like a man sneaking past a sleeping guard. The escape cost approximately $2.5 million in direct bribes. The warden knew, the guards knew, senior government officials knew, and not one of them moved to stop it. He did not sneak out of that prison. He purchased his exit the way other men buy a bus ticket. After his escape, a private helicopter arrived to collect him and fly him back to Sinaloa. That helicopter was sent by Ismael El Mayo Zambada, the man Narcos barely mentioned, who would go on to run the Sinaloa cartel for another 2 decades without ever being arrested. Then came the testimony the United States government spent considerable effort trying to discredit. El Chapo's associate Vicente Zambada Niebla testified under oath in a federal court that the Sinaloa cartel had a direct working arrangement with the Drug Enforcement Administration. The cartel provided the DEA with intelligence on rival organizations. In return, the DEA allegedly left Sinaloa's own operations completely untouched. The United States denied everything. The testimony remains part of the permanent record of a federal trial held on American soil. There is also the matter of Juan Orlando Hernandez, a man most people outside Central America have never heard of. A United States federal indictment states that from 2012, El Chapo and the Sinaloa cartel paid Hernandez millions of dollars in bribes, and that money helped him become president of Honduras in 2013. A sitting president of a sovereign nation, placed in office with cartel money, while El Chapo was simultaneously being hunted by every law enforcement agency in the Western Hemisphere. Narcos never showed you that, because some facts are too structural, too permanent, and too inconvenient for a television drama to contain. May 24, 1993. Guadalajara International Airport. Cardinal Juan Jesus Posadas Ocampo stepped out of his car in the parking lot and walked toward the terminal. 14 bullets stopped him before he reached the door. He was 66 years old and wearing his robes. Mexico closed the case within weeks. The official verdict: El Chapo's men mistook the Cardinal for a rival cartel boss, a case of tragic, unfortunate confusion. Investigative journalist Annabel Hernandez spent years pulling at that explanation. What she found did not support it. The Cardinal had spent months collecting documented evidence, names, transactions, meeting records, connecting senior Mexican politicians directly to cartel operations running under their protection. He was preparing to hand that evidence to people who could act on it. The lawyer for the Archbishop of Guadalajara stated publicly that what happened in that parking lot was not a case of mistaken identity. He called it a coordinated state operation, not a cartel error, but a deliberate act carried out with the direct involvement of people inside the Mexican government. The Mexican Catholic Church never accepted the official story. The Vatican demanded answers for years and received silence every time. In February 1992, 6 of El Chapo's top lieutenants had been found dumped along Tijuana highways, tortured, shot, and left as a message. In November 1992, 6 people were gunned down at a Puerto Vallarta discotheque by Guzmán's men targeting rival traffickers at a table. By May 1993, the war between the cartels had pulled politicians, law enforcement officials, and religious figures into violence they had no preparation for. The Cardinal walked into that parking lot carrying information that certain people in that world could not afford to let reach the public. Almost 30 years later, the case remains technically open. Not one person has been sentenced for the murder of a Catholic cardinal, shot 14 times at a major international airport in the middle of the afternoon. Narcos showed you 40 seconds of confusion and moved forward. The people closest to the truth spent the rest of their lives trying to be heard by anyone who would listen. There is a chapter of El Chapo's story that Narcos passed over in a few minutes of screen time. It was not a few minutes to the people who lived inside it. In September 2004, Rodolfo Carrillo Fuentes, the leader of the rival Juarez cartel, was ambushed with his wife at a shopping mall in Culiacan. Both adults were shot dead in front of their children, who survived. El Chapo ordered that hit, and it was the first time a sitting cartel leader had been killed in public in that manner. It shattered an unspoken agreement between Mexico's major cartels that had kept the worst of the violence away from ordinary civilians. When President Felipe Calderón launched a full military crackdown on cartels in December 2006, he announced it as a war Mexico could win. He was not starting a war. He was stepping into one that El Chapo had already ignited. In a single month in 2008, more than 116 people were murdered in Culiacan alone. 26 of them were police officers. The following month, 128 people were killed. The month after that, 143. A deployment of 2,000 additional military troops to the region failed to reduce the body count by a single digit. The fighting produced more than 60,000 deaths between 2006 and 2012. Those were not all cartel members. Those were mechanics, teachers, market vendors, farmers, and children who happened to live in cities sitting directly on top of smuggling corridors that El Chapo had decided belonged to him. Narcos showed you violence as a dramatic device, rapid cuts, dramatic music, scenes that end before the weight of them settles. These were real human beings, and the man responsible for their death spent his trial in a Brooklyn courtroom listening to lawyers argue procedural points while wearing a pressed suit. El Chapo was not caught because of patient, brilliant law enforcement work. He was caught because he wanted the world to record his name in a way that outlasted him. He wanted a film made about his life, a proper film with a real director, real actors, and a story told on his terms. He contacted actress Kate Del Castillo through a chain of intermediaries, and in October 2015 she arrived in the Mexican jungle with actor Sean Penn sitting beside her. They talked for hours. El Chapo described his submarines, his tunnels, his network, his reach, the way a man carefully rehearses the story he wants told about him after he is no longer around to correct it. While he was sitting in that jungle describing his empire to a Hollywood actor, Mexican authorities were monitoring every call, tracking every device, and mapping every signal connected to anyone at that meeting. 4 days after the conversation ended, Marines hit a ranch near Tamazula, Durango. El Chapo escaped through a tunnel into the drainage system beneath the city and surfaced on a public street. He had no vehicle, no backup, and no option except to wave down a passing car on an ordinary road. He was captured in February 2016 in a hotel room in Los Mochis. The man who had outrun every law enforcement agency on Earth for 13 years, found because he trusted a Hollywood actor to keep a secret in a world where secrets become magazine articles within weeks. Narcos framed his downfall as the inevitable result of justice closing in. Slow, patient, unstoppable. The truth is simpler and darker. His ego did in one afternoon what the DEA could not manage in over a decade of trying. January 8th, 2016. The most powerful drug lord in recorded history stood on a public street in Los Mochis and waved down a stranger's car because he had run out of every other option. That is where the tunnels ended. Not in freedom, in a stolen vehicle on an ordinary road in a city most of the world had never heard of. He had bribed presidents. He had built submarines. He had watched governments bend around him for 40 years like water finding its way around a stone. And in the end, a hotel room and a drainage ditch were the only things standing between him and everything he had built. ADX Florence, Colorado. A concrete cell. 23 hours alone. Every single day. No windows that face the outside world. The man who purchased his way out of 2 maximum security prisons now lives in a structure built around the single purpose of making sure no human being ever leaves it. He was not brought down by law enforcement. He was not outsmarted by any agency or any government. He was destroyed by the oldest weakness a powerful man can carry, the need for the world to know who he really was. He invited a Hollywood actor into the jungle and talked for hours, and the jungle was full of people listening to every word. Power that size does not fall to armies. It falls the moment the man holding it decides that being invisible is no longer enough. El Chapo spent 40 years making himself impossible to find. Then he picked up a phone and told the world exactly where he was. Somewhere in a Colorado cell, in 23 hours of daily silence. Perhaps he has had time to understand what that decision cost him. Or perhaps the darkness is the only thing he has left that still belongs entirely to him.